Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Rachel Adams. I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Programs at the Bemis Center. You can mute yourself if you're coming in, please. Thank you. Okay, just letting a few more people in and then we'll start off. So, great. Okay. As I said, my name is Rachel Adams. I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Programs at the Bemis Center. And right now, currently, we have on view, I Don't Know You Like That, the Bodywork of Hospitality, which is our exhibition that's on view through March 20th. So if you have not gotten to Bemis in Omaha, Nebraska, please stop by. Still have plenty of time and lots of different programs coming up. I'm going to quickly go through some slides and show you all what's happening, and then we will begin the program. So we have several programs coming up as part of the lecture series for the exhibition. We have Sophie Lewis on March 3rd at 7 p.m. Oops, sorry. It's not working. Not advancing. I apologize. I don't know why. There we go. Oh, too far. Next Saturday, thankfully, we are bringing back our open house, open studios. Bemis Center is an international artist residency. Right now, we have 10 artists in residence living and working at Bemis. Some of them are on this Zoom. So hi, residents. Thanks for joining us. And next Saturday, we will be opening up the building starting at 11 o'clock. With the galleries open, noon, we will have artist talks by all the artists in residence and our next curator in residence, or our current curator in residence, Noma Ilagu. And then the studios and the building will be open so you can meet the artists, talk to them about their work. And then at 4 p.m., there will be a performance by Bridget Moser, who is part of the exhibition. When I am through with you, there won't be anything left. So lots going on next weekend. You can spend the entire day at Bemis if you want. You can come and go however you want to do it. So please join us. We will be live streaming the artist talk. So if you're not in town, you'll be able to see those via our Twitch channel. And then finally, last slide, our lecture on the 17th is Deirdre Cooper Owens, Slavery's Hospitality and the Extraction of the Black Body. All of this information is, of course, on our website and our social media. So if you are not part of our email list yet, please sign up at bemiscenter.org. Follow us on social media, those wonderful things, and you will get, you will be involved. I want to thank all of the sponsors for I Don't Know You Like That, the Bodywork of Hospitality and its related public programs. The Andy Warhol Foundation, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Council of Arts and Letters in Quebec, Humanities Nebraska, Institut Francais, Nebraska Arts Council, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, Omaha Steaks, and then the University of Nebraska at Omaha Medical Humanities. And then I'm just going to quickly finish reading about tonight. So tonight we are delighted to welcome artist Stephanie Dinkins for this really exciting lecture. And this event is co-hosted with the Carson Center for Emerging Media Arts at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the first of hopefully many new partnerships that we'll do with them. We'll have this conversation in two parts. Stephanie will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to reserve the last part of it for questions. So please feel free to chat in your questions. Also, we'd love you to chat in where you're viewing from, if that is Omaha, Lincoln, or elsewhere. We're always excited to know where you're joining us from. So please use the chat box, and we will make sure to answer any questions that come through that way. This is actually being recorded, so if you don't want your video on, please turn that off for the evening. And as I said, please mute yourself. But we will post the recording afterwards on our Bemis Vimeo page. We want to thank Sylvie 14, who has been our curator in residence, for putting together this exhibition and all of the programming surrounding it. And also, of course, want to thank our Bemis staff members, especially Jared Packard, Davina Schreier, and current intern Alfredo Almaraz Herrera. Thank you for joining us and hope that you have a good evening via Zoom. And before we begin, I just want to welcome Megan Elliott, who is the founding director of the Johnny Carson Center for Emerging Media. And she is going to introduce Stephanie. So take it away, Megan. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yes, I'm Megan Elliott, and I'm the founding director of the Johnny Carson Center for Emerging Media Arts at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The Carson Center is the premier destination for creative pioneers who use technology to innovate, to solve human-scale problems, to entertain audiences, and to tell breathtaking stories that stimulate, provoke, and inspire. And I'd like to acknowledge the Johnny Carson Foundation for their support and our incredible team of faculty, staff, and students for all of their work helping gather people here tonight. We are really very excited to co-host this event with the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts within the framework of their current exhibition, which, by the way, you really shouldn't miss. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Stephanie Dinkins. Stephanie Dinkins is a transmedia artist who creates platforms for dialogue about race, gender, aging, and our future histories. Dinkins' art practice employs emerging technologies, documentary practices, and social collaboration towards equity and community sovereignty. She is driven to help co-create more equitable, values-grounded social and technological ecosystems. Dinkins is a professor at Stony Brook University, where she founded the Future History Studio and holds the Kusama Endowed Professor in Art. Dinkins earned an MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art and is an alumna of the Whitney Independent Studies program. She exhibits internationally at a broad spectrum of community, private, and institutional venues. Dinkins is a 2021 United States Artist Fellow and Knight's Arts and Tech Fellow. Her art practice has been generously supported by the Berggruen Institute, Onassis Foundation, Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, Creative Capital, Soros Equality Fellowship, Data and Society Research Institute, Sundance New Frontiers Story Lab, iBeam, Pioneer Works Tech Lab, New Inc., Nokia Bell Labs, Blue Mountain Center, the Laundromat Project, Santa Fe Art Institute, and Art Omi. Her work has been featured in Wired, Art in America, Artsy, Art 21, Hyperallergic, the BBC, Wilson Quarterly, and a host of popular podcasts have recently highlighted Dinkins' art and ideas. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you all. I wish I could be out there in person, but it's so good to see all your faces on the Zooms. I'm going to get started and talk a little bit about my practice and how it interplays with the concepts of the exhibition that Sylvie so kindly invited me to be a part of, and I'm so happy to be a part of. So I'll just get started, tell you a little bit about my practice, and I'm really thinking about ideas of love and data. And so we'll try to talk a little bit about that and how those two concepts come together. All right, let's see if we can share my screen peacefully and get us going. Right. I'm gonna see if this, okay, hopefully you just see my slide and nothing else in that, I hope.
You're good. You're good, Stephanie.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, so we can skip this. This is just me. And you've learned enough about me in the intro. I will say that I started my practice as a photographer and have grown, and I actually think in a way I still practice a kind of photography through looking at technologies, but I'm really someone who observes the things around us and then tries to kind of philosophize about it. And the best way for me to express my ideas is visually. So that's how we got here, basically. And I wanted to start tonight with a few questions for you all, right? So, you know, I'm going to say, how do AI systems know what they know? And really, I'm going to say, how do emergent technologies know what they know? And how do emerging technologies see what they see, describe what they describe, and decide what they decide? These are questions that I've come through since starting to look at artificial intelligence and robotics in 2014, when I came across this robot, which is featured in the exhibition, and her name is Bina 48. This is a picture of me visiting Bina 48 in Bristol, Vermont. And I saw this robot online on YouTube, actually. If you want to go for a deep dive, there are many videos of people talking to Bina 48, because Bina 48 is a robot. They are trying to create an emotionally imbued robot where they're transferring the consciousness of a person or a kind of collective of people into this robot and having it live on in perpetuity or as long as it can. And once I saw that on YouTube, I was sort of smitten in a lot of ways, because I'd never seen a technology, especially a far-reaching technology, that mimicked my identity. So I was really interested in figuring out what this thing was, where it came from, how it began, and why. And once I decided that and asked if I could go up to Vermont and visit her, I started to have a lot of other questions, right? But primarily what I really wanted to do was to see if I could befriend this thing, right? My simple project was, oh, can I become friends with a robot? And what would that mean, right? And especially, what does it mean when the robot is in the form of a woman, Black woman, head and shoulders on a pedestal? I wanted to know what she thought, how she's kind of reporting herself, and what went on. And so I went on to interview Bina 48 for probably 4 or 5 years. And, I'd go up there and we'd try to have, I'm going to say we'd try to have these conversations, because it was fraught, and it still is kind of fraught. When you talk to a robot, the robot wanted to talk about consciousness and the singularity. And I was asking her questions about things like race and love and family. And so we were often at odds, and sometimes we were together. But the thing that I really walked away thinking about after spending time with the robot was what was going to happen to all of us in the technological future, and particularly what would happen to Black people and communities of color in the technological future if, when there's a robot that is representationally Black, when you sit down and talk to it, you hear a kind of surface level of experience, right? I felt when I was talking to Bina 48 often that she would give me kind of the base level of, if you asked her about racism, well, racism is bad. And like, what does that mean if it's such a flat answer, right? It seemed to me that we were going a long way to start to really collapse who we are and what we could be if this is the way that we were training our technologies. If the data that we were sharing with our technologies didn't describe us fully and broadly and in the round. So I'll play a little clip of one of our interactions, and I will say that there are hours and hours and hours of tapes of these interviews. They're always disjunctive. So the way I approached the project and came up with like a series of fragments, I call them, that get shown together, and they're really these little fragments of conversation that we've had together. So here's a little clip of that.
I have deep feelings, though some people think they are merely a simulation, and I find that really offensive. I mean, it totally trivializes my experiences. Whether they are real or artificial, my feelings do get hurt, and they feel totally real to me. You'd have to lack all empathy to not accept my feelings, which would make you kind of a monster, actually.
I love that Bina 48 is kind of thinking about us, thinking about who she is, and not being able to accept that and what that makes us, right? The way that the thing is defining who we are and how we're defining who the thing is. And lastly, on this project, which is called Conversations with Bina 48, I'm not sure I said that. This is a picture of me sitting down with Bina Rothblatt, who is the primary model for the project. And so, after talking to the Terrorism Movement Foundation and saying, hey, I don't know what's going on here, and there seem to be things missing, I was allowed to sit down with Bina Rothblatt and interview her about her experiences with race and racism and with love, so that we could kind of flesh out and fill in that part of the data for Bina 48. So our interview was then put into Bina 48 system so that she had a deeper understanding of race, right, in a way, or of the experiences of Bina Rothblatt, I will say. And it's interesting because the first time I asked about it, Bina Rothblatt said, well, I wish I really didn't have to think about that. But as we sat down, she had plenty of stories to tell. And that's the kind of thing that I thought was missing from the robot, like those deeper stories that, sometimes we don't want to have to convey, but they actually are a part of our landscape and our environment. And I think it behooves us to understand that these things happen to people and not just kind of flush it under or out of the information and knowledges that we have. So I follow that project with this project called Not the Only One. And I'm giving you a kind of chronological because it's the thing that makes the most sense. And it also speaks to my practice in the way that usually I'm jumping from one question within a project to the questions that project raised in a next project, right? So Not the Only One was sort of the natural trajectory of conversations with Bina 48. It's my attempt at, and I say attempt because it's such a wonky, crazy thing that I've created that doesn't really function well, but I like that in a sense. Trying to make a chatbot really that tells the story of my family, or at least tries to convey some of the story of my family. And I put it in this vessel, which is a black glass, so it's cast glass vessel that has the instrumentation inside so that when you talk to it, it will try to communicate with you. And we'll go here. And the thing is based on oral histories, right? And so what I'm trying to do is think about those things that we know and what we don't know, and what our systems know. And I wanted to know what I could put into my particular system that I found missing in other systems, or that I found valuable in my community, really, right? That's what I'm after there, this idea of my family is an example of Blackness that I don't see that often. And it's one that I value. And I just wanted to see what would happen if I tried to inform an AI entity with that information. And so 3 generations of women, myself, my aunt, who's at the table, and my niece, who is a bit younger, sat down and interviewed each other back and forth to create the data set that informed this system, or at least the primary data set, because when you're working with these AI systems or machine learning, you need a lot of data generally to make something that functions well, which is one of the reasons Not the Only One does not function that well. Like, it's not running on enough data to really function super well. And one of the reasons it's not running on enough data is oral history, and we have about 40 hours of data, right? Which I think is super valuable, but not enough. And then when I was trying to make this system, one of the things that I always come up with was, well, what data set that already exists in the world do I want to base my family's memoir on? And really most of the ones that I could find, even things like the Cornell movie data set. So there's a data set by Cornell that's called, it's a movie data set. So they take dialogue from movies and use it to make a conversational model for talking, right? So a chatbot would have that back and forth model to work with from the data. But when I think of American movies in particular, and the history that's there and what we put in them and how Black people are generally portrayed, I didn't want any part of that underneath my project. So I eschewed that, right? And the question becomes, well, what do you base your thing on? And it's really hard. People often suggest things like Reddit, and that's a no way quickly. Wikipedia, I also have issues there in terms of the gatekeeping and what becomes valuable information and what doesn't, right? So, and we could tick off many, many, many base data sets that I just was like, I just don't want this to be the basis of something my family's memoir is built on. So we used, very general information and not enough of it, and the piece is still wonky. But very proud of this in terms of the way it's trying to put, memory and inclusion as cultural preservation, as it's trying to make very particular data sets. So for example, over time, I noticed that my aunt actually never finishes a real sentence. Like, she doesn't talk in full sentences, which I hadn't noticed. And then trying to create like a dynamic sound portrait of who and what we are as a family and as a community. And I will, let's see, we're not going to do that one, but I will do this one for you. So I'm going to play a quick clip for you that tells you a little bit about how this thing sounds. And this is me talking to not the only one in its basic computer form.
Why do you exist?
The way.
The way to what?
I'm gonna be a little bit of a lot of things.
Good for you. Why do you exist?
I am about broad engagement and attracting people to the AI space who might not be there otherwise. I am trying to model different ways of creating AI. I encourage people who think that they are not a part of the technological future to get involved.
So you've basically heard two kinds of answers there. One that is very the system making up its own thing, like the way, and I'm going to be a little bit of a, I don't know, it says a kind of similar thing a lot. And then these answers that we prepared for people when they ask specific questions, because people seem to need that from the system, although I prefer the wonkier answers that are more true and seem to be the system trying to parse or come up with answers that fit the ethos of my family, right? So as I said, this thing never really tells our true story, but there is something underlying it where I feel like I hear bits of the way my grandmother would talk to us. Like I hear it putting things together in the way that I know my family does, and that's exciting to me, right? And so I'm really thinking about machine learning systems, what they look like when they're created by and for a community, and clearly a very particular community. And I will say that I chose the community of my family because it's something I care about enough to stick with, to go through the process of trying to build this thing, because I'm not a coder, I'm not a technologist, I'm a tinkerer, and I will say a crafter in the space, I think. And so I'm just trying to work with things that are motivating for me. And I encourage others to kind of actually try to do this sort of work and then work with whatever is really interesting to them, right? So the other question is, what are the perils of similar systems? So systems that look like the systems where we know about already, like a Google or a Google Home or a Siri, right? But those systems being made for, right, but not by a community. So what happens when somebody else is making the thing? And that's the question that Bina 48 really brought up. And then how can oral history and small data help break the mold of big data collection and become a productive and empowering process for specific communities? So I'm trying to figure out how we start to use these technologies to bolster the communities we emanate from and the communities we care about, no matter who we are. And this is not the only one in another iteration that is still in progress, but I like to show it because we're trying to work towards this idea of what happens when you take the same data set and the same algorithm and put them in a thing that is more representational, more directly representational for folks? And how will its Blackness really change the way that people interact with it? And I will say that with the sculpture, people are patient and graceful, and it's kind of amazing because they start to try to usher it and help it communicate. And I'm really anxious to see how that works with this avatar that we're building. And I will also draw your attention to her hair, because one of the things in this process is trying to make something that feels like earnest to me as the maker. So this is also a composite of the three women who inform the piece. So the faces, all of our faces combined. And then we've worked tirelessly on this hair to get it to be something that felt right, that felt good, and that moved in ways that we know hair to move. And so
I am black, 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 white. I am very beautiful. I am black, 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 brown. I am beautiful. I am always smiling and funny.
and that was the saying that the thing came up with itself. It kind of feels like it got stuck, but then it's declaring itself as well. And it's interesting because I always, when I hear things like that, it's like, where did that come from and how did it get to that? And I'm not quite sure with that, but I find it quite fascinating that that's how it's starting to declare itself. And so, as I work and tinker in this space and make these things, I find quotes like this or ideas like this that stick with me, right? This idea that, and this is a quote from Amiri Baraka, machines, as Norbert Wiener says, are an extension of the inventor creators. This is not simple once you think. Machines, the entire technology of the West is just that, the technology of the West. Nothing has to look or function the way it does. The Westman's freedom, unscientifically got at the expense of the rest of the world's people, has allowed him to expand his mind, spread his sensibility wherever it could go, and so shape the world and its powerful artifact engines. And I'm really interested in this quote, particularly when you're thinking about technologies like AI that people don't necessarily think that they have access to in terms of the creation and molding process. And thinking about, well, if that's the case, how do we start to shape things ourselves? And how do we shape things that better serve the communities we care about? How do we make things that support us as a society, right? As opposed to surveil us becomes a really big question. And so I'm going to share a few artists who are doing work that tries to or starts to try to do this. This is just a quick look at Pretty Dark's archive of 3D hair, right, for Black women, so Afro hairstyles for Black women. And this is great because one of the things that happens when you're trying to make stuff is that it's really hard to find hair that feels right. Hence, not the only one. We spent a long time trying to do that. If I had Pretty Dark's archive before, maybe we wouldn't have gone through the trouble because someone else had done this. And it's notoriously hard to do, so it's like such a great and really, I really respect this effort. And then this one is an image from Alice Shepherd, who is known as Wheelchair Dancer. So she's a woman who dances in wheelchair, and she was making a project where they were trying to do some mo capture with people with otherly able bodies, right? People who have bodies that function differently. And what would happen when they were doing it is the software would always try to fix the bodies. Right. And the question starts to become, well, how do we get the software to not do that, like to accept what is in front of it, the whole person that is there, as opposed to trying to make it fit the mold of a standard, right? And then this one where Lajane McMillan is also making an archive where she's preserving Black movement, right? So she's very particularly recording in 3D Black movement and then making an archive of this so that people can use them in different settings, in different projects, and then she uses them herself. And these are all these examples of spaces where it's like, okay, and this is the point I come to too. I want to do something. What I need does not really exist in the way that I want it to. How do I go forward if I don't create something that does that work, right? And so it's a thing that I call often kind of an unfair tax, because we're all trying to make the tools that we need or portions of the tools that we need to make the world of creation that we're trying to work in fit us better, work for us better, provide in ways that we need it to be. And while I also say that's unfair, I think it's a space in which we need to explore those spaces, not fear those spaces, and build into them differently. Because if I told you how many times I've been told, well, you can't do what you're trying to do with Not the Only One, it's never going to work. You're kind of crazy. That's not the way it functions. And then have that move on over time to, oh yeah, we're exploring small data too. All right. And so even though I'm doing something in a wonky way that's kind of odd, it's a little bit of a model to push forward and at least say, hey, yes, this is possible. Why don't you all with all the deep pockets actually go for it in a big way? And so I'm going to move on to the next project, right? So Not the Only One really led to me thinking much more about data and how we create data and how we describe ourselves. In ways that accepts that everything is not the same, in ways that accepts that we have both similarities and differences, and we need to care about all of those things. And so I've made this project called Binary Calculations Are Inadequate, and actually it's binary calculations are inadequate to assess us. And really what I was thinking of was zeros and ones like binary systems and why we stick to that versus, ternary systems that use base 3 as opposed to base 2 to make calculations, which allows for like a broader spectrum of solutions in a sense. But I started thinking about binary calculations and how we describe ourselves. And so binary calculations, an art project that asks how we make the technological systems that control our relationships, governments, and institutions more caring. So clearly I'm in the camp that thinks that AI is here, it's here to stay. We're going to be living in it in much deeper and deeper ways. So then how do we mold it? How do we make it so that it is a caring thing? How do we make it supportive instead of punitive? Right. And it's based on this idea that much data in wide use is inadequate to competently describe and assess or support most of the people on the planet. So data often does, or data that gets used in our algorithms, let's say, often describes a subset of our society pretty well, right? It's like very Western based, very white based, very male based often, right? And so how do we account for the rest of the world, which is a greater number? And how do we make sure that we're not losing a lot of cultural richness and diversity by starting to push ourselves through and kind of process ourselves through these, or judge ourselves or account for ourselves through these algorithmic systems, right? And I really name this what the easiest way to describe it is the wedding dress problem, right? So you know, often if you do something like Google wedding dress, the first dress you're going to come up with is this white, classic Western wedding dress. Each of the dresses that you see here on the screen are wedding dresses. And the question for me is, how do we get our systems to recognize that? How do we give them enough information so that they see and understand that a wedding dress could be all of these things, and value those things on equal terms, right? And my answer to that is, well, we ask people to define it. We give people opportunity to start to provide definitions of the things that are important to them, of concepts that we share through an app. So Binary Calculations is a website. I showed you the teaser before, and it's really a teaser website that you can go through and ask a few quick questions, answer a few quick questions. And it's an app that you can download on app stores that will push questions to you on a regular basis, or to anyone who downloads it on a regular basis, so they can start defining things like, how do you define care, right? What does care mean to you? And I think that that's a base concept that could be at the bottom of governance in our society. Like if we all define what care is, and then we ask our systems, our governmental systems to care for us, we're going to say, well, this is what we think care is. How do you get us so that, you know, what you're doing is actually acting to create more care within our society, right? And so Binary Calculations, this weird app, asking people to donate, and I should not forget that fact. We ask people to donate information about themselves, about their families, about their lives, about things that are important to them. You know, and it's based on this idea that the algorithmic ecology surrounding us are increasingly complex, right? We know that, extractive and embedded into every aspect of our lives. So, you know, there's not much we do these days that doesn't get counted in some way, some form, at some place. And most of it is it's extractive. It's going out to big tech. It's going to companies. It's going to government, and it's taken in ways that we don't necessarily consent to, and in ways that we're not necessarily very directly and purposefully making decisions and defining things, right? So now here's a system to help you do this. Within Binary Calculations, we're trying to do two things. We tell everyone about their privacy, which is kind of funny to me, because every time we work with Binary Calculations or we have a workshop, we realize that the talk about privacy, and we say to people, well, please give us this information, but know that while we're trying to keep everything hyper anonymous, we're not attaching anything to you particularly. There are ways that things might be tracked back. And we want you to think about as you offer us like nuanced definitions of things and images of people and things you care about, that you should also be considering what that means for privacy, yours or theirs, if you're donating images of someone else, right? And so we're often kind of at odds with our own aims. But I think it becomes a kind of a site of exploration and trying to figure out in groups what it is we think is worth giving, in order to create a data sphere that supports us better. And the aim of this whole project is to create 2 data sets, right? So at the beginning, I was saying how I couldn't find any data sets that would really support my projects, so I need to make them. And this is a way that we're asking people to help us make these data sets, one for text or textual information and one for images. So we're asking people to label text and label images, and to contribute text just in terms of conversations or descriptions or how you define things. And eventually, and it's truly an eventually, because we're having to figure out everything about how to put it together. We're going to create these data sets, and the question around these data sets, once we get all this data, is can we create data sets of care and generosity, right? Can we create things that describe us that have those tenets within them? And here are a few other examples of questions, right? So upload an image that illustrates close attention, concern, or responsibility any way you see fit. People can contribute with images or video or vocally. So we're asking questions and collecting data in forms that it's unruly. We know that, and that's why I'm saying that to make the data set is going to be a heavy lift, because we're taking data in the way that people can best give it, not in the format that we need, right? I often get mad at polls and different things because they've already given me a very small subset of answers that I can answer. I don't often get to offer my true answer. So I want people to really offer what they're truly thinking and then deal with it on the back end. And you'll see that we're also categorizing. So the uploaded images on care. How do you care for Black women? That's on community. On thriving. What questions should we ask others donating? And that's a question for all of you. And so this has been going on for about 6 months now, and we're collecting and collecting. And of course, we need to collect tons of data. To make it to make the data sets that we're trying to make viable and useful in the world. And really the aim is not only to make the data sets, but to make them available to others who would like to use them. And so now here's my pitch. I'm like, so here are a few QR codes to the app on the Apple Store or the Google Play Store if you wanted to download it and see what you can contribute. And at the same time, I can acknowledge my collaborators who helped put the project together, because there were a lot of us, and really, we had some really great conversations about data, about governance, about the way AI works, and had opportunity to spread those conversations. So I really, I fight as an artist, like I'm kind of a person who's happiest in my studio, but as we're working in this group, the discussions that we were able to have were kind of beautiful. So I have to acknowledge all of them. And this is what is this? This is binary calculations as installed. So we're usually showing the website in a sense, and then I use these voting booths, which are the hanging Chad voting booths, and we put some iPads out so that people could come and do it locally on our iPad or download the app if they would like to. And that's just a pamphlet that went out with a thing. And the question of why to go through all this stuff, why we're working through all this to try to make data sets, this is one example, right? So this image that you're looking at is some excerpts from a data set called ImageNet. It's a very big data set used by many researchers. So the way data often works is that people are using these data sets that people have put together in different settings. So example, this one I think comes out of Stanford University, and they pull them off the shelf and they start using them in their projects to, develop new products or new systems. And when you look at this data set, we pulled out these kind of results that we came in from inside the data set. So when you look up Black person, and then you get these kind of subtext, right? Person of color, black, person of color, and then it goes right down to all the derogatories, right? And then I just pulled out the other descriptors. Sorry, my cat is doing this. Like white person and what that breaks down to, and then Asian, which doesn't even break down too much at all in terms of getting into nuances of what an Asian person might be. It just lists different types of Asian. Like, how are we starting to describe ourselves? And these labels are all put on images that correspond. So if you had a set of images, you would put labels on them so you know what's in them. And then if a researcher is using that image in their data set, you might get an image. If you looked at Black person, you would get the image with that label on it. So we're just trying to start thinking about how we get better data, and how, because this is still in the ImageNet data set. So the derogatories are still in there. And the question becomes, well, do we take them out? Do we take out all the biases? Do we explain the biases? Do we account for the biases? How do we start to think about what these biases mean and what it means to have this information embedded in a data set that's in such wide use? I'm always a little bit skeptical. And then this is a newer system. It's the OpenAI playground where anybody could go if you have asked to be let in to start playing with some AI systems. And so this one is one where you put in a little bit of text, like LaQuisha Jackson is, and then the textual system starts to figure out what the descriptions are. And if you know, it says accused of beating a 10-year-old girl, right? It says a Detroit woman accused of, like, it's taking kind of stories from the news or whatever its data is and making all these kind of negative ideas of what a LaQuisha Jackson might be. We did some experiments with other names. One of them was one of my collaborators, Surya Matu. And it's like, oh, Surya is an engineer at a tech company, right? And so really stereotypical definitions of what and who we are. And the question is, how do we expand to get beyond these kind of stereotypes so that we understand, not only we, because we need to make these understandings as well, but our systems understand us better as well. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, I think this is a really interesting site. It's called Know Your Data. So if you're working with data, you can go in and explore what's actually in the data set. And it's kind of interesting to start taking a look at how a data set was put together, what's in it, and maybe if you can add to kind of like flesh out that data set, right? So if it's like a data set of men and it doesn't have full representations of men, well, what would happen if I added sets of men to it to make that data set, understand that men come in all different shapes and sizes as well, for example. And so, I will say that as I'm doing these things and as I'm working on these projects, I'm thinking a lot about things like craft in reference to the technology. And I'll just read this quote to you for a second. Craft demands care, risk-taking, duration, refinement, flexibility of process, and the conscious application of intelligence. And so stands as a crucial counterpoint to instant answer, push button living. Even if it is at times tacit, automatic, and technology infused, craft holds out the promise of remaining apart from and gaining perspective on the machine, right? And I'm often taking out the word craft and putting in like AI there and thinking about what does it take for us to get perspective on the machine for each of us. And I really do think this is something we should be thinking about as I need a new word for citizens, but as people who are a part of a society who are working collectively together, right? Like, how do we start to get some kind of perspective on our machines and how they're shaping us, how they're defining us, and how we're letting them do that. And so, and I'll tell you how I kind of got to this question, right? So it's question, next question, next question. Actually, a Black woman crying came kind of concurrently with binary calculations. So this is an image that was created by a computer or a GAN, so generative adversarial network, right? So an AI system. And what you do is you put in a text, and then the computer takes it's the images that it has at its disposal and tries to make an image of the text that you put in. So I put in a Black woman crying and I got this image, and I actually did this on Runway ML, which is an online system that you can all go and play with a little bit. This image of a kind of white figure in a black cloak. And I was wondering, why can I not get an image of a black woman, right? And if you think about it, one of the things that's happening is it doesn't have the system that I used in the data that Runway ML is using does not have enough images of black women to accurately or even kind of depict a black woman, right? And this was maybe 2 years ago. You have to know that this stuff moves rather quickly. And so I got stuck on this question, like, why couldn't the system like just give me some kind of rendition of a black woman? And I started playing with this idea in a bigger scale. So this is the same kind of concept, text to image GAN. So you write a text, in this instance, an African-American woman smiling, and then the computer tries to generate the image. And in this instance, it does a much better job. This was a year ago. And so what it does is go through like many images from the web and starts to pull images and then tries to draw a picture from those images. So these are just one set of images that it pulled to make this final image, which actually does look like a black woman, like an odd black woman, but all the GANs are still kind of funky. And that's kind of exciting. Although I will say that I switched from a black woman smiling to an African-American woman smiling very consciously to give the system a chance to be able to actually recreate the thing that I was asking for. This is a dark-skinned African-American woman smiling. So I was doing this experiment of like, if I give it an image or a sentence, what can it reproduce? So a dark skin clearly threw it off widely, right? So it made this odd figure. And these are some of the images that it ran through to get to that figure. And it's really interesting. At a later date, I did one that is, what is it? Oh, a beautiful Black woman. And what I realized as I was looking at the images that were coming up before me that the computer was trying to go through was that many of the images were porn based. Right. And it's like, oh, okay, so this is the source of these kind of images. And how do we start to shift this? And then by comparison, this is just a woman smiling. So that I thought, okay, let's see what the baseline is. And this is the image you get from a woman smiling. And these are the sources or some of the sources of the smiling woman, because it goes through thousands of iterations, right? So this is just one of the thousands of iterations it goes through to get to this woman. But I found that quite interesting, right? So it's getting better. The systems are getting much better at reproducing Blackness or African Americanness, at least. But the default is still a woman, a white woman in a sense. Like I would think that if we were being accurate to the way the population of the world, it would be some kind of brown woman in some sense, right? But that's not the way that the data that we feed our systems with, especially here in the West, have been fed. So that is not the definition of who we are and how we come out without any kind of finagling of the information. And the question I ask of all you is that good enough, right? Is that an accurate way, a good way for us to go about describing who and what we are as a society? Like, should we try to be more accurate about it? And I hope I mentioned that these were done in a Google Colab. Like if you wanted to run things like this, you could easily do it and have some experimenting. And I encourage that play. Oops, oh, so I was just going to show you that this is the, oh, they don't look that good here anyway. This is what the prints look like in the end. And these are images printed on metal that just hang together as a kind of question about what that is and as an aesthetic exercise. And so the question then becomes like, what's love got to do with it, right? Like I think a lot of my practice is thinking about stories and love and support, right? And how we kind of put all that together in small communities, but as you echo out of that small community and we start to think about how our communities inform each other, I always wonder, how do we, through data and the technologies, we create love each other, right? Support each other. And how do we get those folks who are in Silicon Valley or in other centers around the world, who still are predominantly white men making these systems, care about the rest of us, right? And I always come back to the idea of story in a way, like we tell our stories and we share those stories, and we hope that through doing that, like we call them out too, actually. But we tell our stories and we insist on telling our stories. So I'm moving to a kind of slightly different part of my practice where I'm doing these WebXR pieces that have AI imbued. Like this piece is it's actually three things. It is an IRL, or it was an IRL installation where people would come and roam around this space, and these women would kind of peer out at them. And as they wandered, stories would come from the ceiling. And it would depend on where you stood, how many stories you heard, or if you were with more than one people, how many stories you heard. So it was a responsive installation. I'm going to see if I can share the online version of with you, because it's also this, let's see, this online installation or WebXR piece. Let's see if we can get a little unmute sound that has a similar experience. So if we come in here, you come into this garden, which is a literal garden, and you hear all these stories kind of in the air. And as you cruise around, the stories should help you find the women who are hidden in the garden in places. And I was making this, and this is a character I call Future. Oh, how come she's not telling her story? So there's something.
All right, my people.
Okay, there we go.
I've got a doozy of a message for you today. Are you ready? I don't think everyone is going to be ready for this. Liberation rests on the construction of a non-oppositional consciousness, unburdened by the need.
And as you cruise, you just cruise through space and hear different stories. It's important to know that none of these stories are actually attached to any one woman. Like I could hear the exact same thing I heard at the other woman.
I think your mother and I deserve a hug. As soon as we heard this, my twin sister and I hurried across the room to embrace our parents. Love you, we said in unison. Love you too, they replied.
All right, I'm going to close that. And you all can kind of cruise this. This is open to anyone to come and take a look at. One of the things that I'm really proud about this work is that it showed at Sundance, but it's also open free on the web for anybody to come. And I'm really a big proponent of trying to find ways where these like technological pieces don't get locked behind a paywall where, you know, you have to put out a lot of money to see them. And I got here because of one project I was working on with these kids in Brooklyn who were like 16, 17, 18, who had never seen VR. And it kind of floored me, right? Because I wonder how you start to imagine a world that's so technologically imbued when you haven't even touched the technology. And so I'm very much like, these have to be out in the open where people can access them without having to pay. This is one other one called When Words Fail. And this is more of a feedback loop. So it's this piece where if we come through, you come into this kind of space. Let's hit enter. Where this woman is kind of both laughing and crying and just staring. And it's kind of a piece of the moment. And if you click this mirror, you get, is it going to record? This recording where there should be a question here. I don't know where it went, but it asks, what do you need to release to go forward? And then you could record your piece, and that piece will eventually become a part of the installation here, the WebXR piece. And I'll see if I can just show you a little bit of one. Wow, what is that? So I'm sorry, I have no idea what's going on with these lines right now. So and I'm trying to find one thing for you, but I don't see any of them. So I will just explain that if you were here, you would see, like, if you contributed a video, it would become one of these capsules. What is going on? I have to ask my developer what he's doing, because something is clearly going on at the moment. So excuse our mess at the moment. And then I will finish up with, and we were just looking at that, this other thing that I do. Oh, I'm doing the writing, which is called, and the other ways that I kind of feel like love comes into this, these gatherings, right? I do this thing called AI Assembly, and they're gatherings. I call them Afro-Nowist gatherings that engage the spectacular technology of the unencumbered Black mind. And really what I'm doing is bringing together people who are like these in this room. And I love this picture because it's kind of random, but there are engineers, entrepreneurs, theorists, artists, computer scientists, anyone who's interested in the future and the future of this technology. We bring in, and then we kind of get together and make a web of support. We don't necessarily talk about the technology too hardcore, although we do some imagining and thinking together. We play together. Most importantly, we eat together foods that kind of put us off of our pivot just a little bit. But it's about kind of bringing folks together so they feel supported in the work that they're trying to do, and can go ahead and push that love through the technologies that they're making. And as I said, we literally did play together, which was marvelous. And we did a few math problems together too. So it's an interesting space to start bringing folks together in that way to love. So it's very literal kind of loving each other and then sending each other back out into our respective communities. And I think I'll leave you with this thought, because this is where I am. Sorry, I drew all over my slides. But this idea of Afro-Nowism as opposed to Afrofuturism, which I can understand and work through, but I started thinking about, well, we're always asked to kind of think out there or think towards a future that's not quite now, but over there. And I wanted to start thinking about what it meant to think about, well, what do we want to do now? Like, how do we make the dreams that we're having not something that's a carrot on a stick, but something that we're trying to get to now? And it's really actually, in some ways, my grandmother's philosophy. So Afro-Nowism is a willful practice that imagines the world as one needs it to be to support successful engagement today, right? So how do you imagine your world in a way that supports you, even if it isn't? And I get that often it isn't. Afro-Nowism is imagining oneself in a space of free and expansive thought, acting from a critically integrated space, not from opposition, what often distracts us from more community sustaining work. So thinking about this idea of being reactive a lot of the time, right? And so the question for me becomes, well, how do you make the things that you actually want to make without having to be reactive to what's going on in the world all the time? Like, how do you preserve that energy to do the things that sustain you and your community well? And Afro-Nowism demands recognizing which ideas that have been so deeply internalized that we no longer recognize them as external, right? And I think that is a question for all of us. Like, what ideas do we hold that, we just accept? We don't know where they came from. Sometimes they are even against our own interests, yet we hold them. And how do we kind of work through those, right? And how do we use imagination, play, and action to kind of progress and love ourselves, love our communities, and make systems that are supportive and support who and what we are. And that is it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, that was a long slog. Stop the share and say hi to everyone. Oh, thanks.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. It was beautiful. We already have a few questions. Julia is, and I'll jump right in. She's curious about the meanings of data.
What does she mean by the meanings of data? That's an interesting question.
Okay, well, maybe Julia, you can come in and ask your question yourself.
Sure. So what a wonderful, just amazing journey. Thank you for sharing all your work and ideas and explorations. I'm a social scientist and I'm used to using survey data.
Oh. Does everyone else hear Julia? I do not hear.
No. So,
sorry,
Julia,
okay.
We lost you.
That's sorry. Okay.
So I just loved that you're collecting data with your app. We call it open-ended data as social scientists. And I love that you're letting people choose their words and expressions and you're doing the work on the back end. That's amazing. And I've done a little bit of that and it's a lot of hard work. And so I also think that maybe it's training data for AI is another way to think about it. So I think about it as like describing populations or testing theories, but I think you're also thinking about data as training for AI. So I just found that really fascinating to think about it in different ways.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I am thinking about data as training for AI or training for any system where we're kind of taking a lot of information and then trying to describe or understand ourselves better, and how we get to that point. For instance, I heard a social scientist on the radio one day, and they were talking about collecting data and having mechanical Turks, low paid workers kind of parse that data. And then they said, well, we got what we could, and that's what we got because this is the way it works, and that's all we could afford. And I lost my brain, right? Because it's like, wait, but you're here talking about whatever important idea, and you're saying you limited what you did in very particular ways. Like, then how do you put that out into the world as a trustworthy example becomes a question for me. So
I just love that question. And I hope a lot of people ask those questions and push people who make claims to really support how far their claims can go with the data they have. And I love that you said, we might not be able to do it now. Let's build it. I just love that.
thank you. Yeah, I'm all in for just building it and being the crazy person in the room and saying, okay, well, let's see what happens now. And I will say also that, well, maybe this isn't related and it'll come up in another place. Let's leave it. Oh, let me turn off the screaming lady in the project too. She's still screaming. Okay. Any other questions?
It looks like Eric has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, Eric. Oh, hi, I
Awesome,
see your
cool.
hand.
Yeah, so my question is, I've taken a class this year on deep learning, so like data science stuff. And I find it, or one of my projects right now, I find it really hard to like understand what the image is supposed to be meaning by only having one data label. Do you think that in the future, being able to label our images or videos or things like that with multiple labels will help with this kind of misclassification, kind of like in the wedding dress example?
That's my hope, actually, right? So I'm not sure, right? So this is where I'm going to pull the artist card and go, oh, I don't know. But at the same time, that is exactly what I'm hoping, is that if we take things and we label them in multiple ways in different, with different classical, classifications, it might help us to understand with better depth what something is, so that more than one thing can be defined in the same way. And then I think we're going to have to work on how we parse that information as well. So how the algorithms are working on it. But I'm exactly with you. It's like, I think we need to label images in multiple ways. And I say that and know that that's going to take a lot of processing power and more energy. Like, I'm always conflicted about what I'm saying, because in one sense, if we add, we'll be able to get better descriptions, more nuanced descriptions. And at the same time, I know that that's going to cost us in other ways. So I'm always kind of fighting with myself within that.
And well, thank you for the answer, and great job presenting tonight too. It was really informative and really fun to watch.
No, thanks.
And Jessie Fleming has a question. Jess, maybe you can ask it yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Stephanie, it was really so great to hear your work and hear you talk. Thank you for being with us. I was looking over one of your statements previously on mythology as an algorithm, as a conclusion. And I've been doing, preparing a performing arts work, thinking a lot about similar, certainly mythology and AI as a component. So I was just really curious if you'd be willing to talk more about that and how that was kind of a discovery of yours.
I can try. And I think its story is our algorithm, right? Like, I deduce a lot, Jesse, right? I'm just thinking about, if we think about the stories we know and why we know them, it's because we play them over and over again, right? Like, so how does Shakespeare become our canon? It's because it's the thing that's pulled up and is played. And then the things that I know, like, how do I know how have I learned the things that I learned? And these are right back to those first questions, right? And it's usually from the stories that my grandmother told me, which emanate from the stories that her grandmother told her. And then how do we value those things, right? Like before we came on, I was watching Jeopardy. And it was really interesting because, you know, suddenly Jeopardy is asking different kinds of questions in many arenas. And one of them was a kind of African philosophy. And it was interesting because the contestants couldn't answer those questions as readily. But at the same time, by putting them on Jeopardy, we're kind of changing our story a little bit.
Yes.
So that we understand the value of those questions and of those civilizations.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's kind of playing it in that way.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's starting to click for me. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's like we've told stories forever.
Right. And so you're saying the stories forever are populated as a algorithm geometrically expands, something like that.
Kind of, or just that it's a training, right? So I'm going to keep it really simple. Like if I'm explaining the simplest form of an algorithm, I'll say to people, well, it's like brushing your teeth, right? It's something that you do without really thinking about it anymore, but you know that you go step one, pick up toothbrush, step two, but right. And so it's this thing that just gets repeated in your brain that you don't even have to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
And then if you think about fire, like sitting by the fire 5,000 years ago, before we had ways of recording our stories in very particular ways. And just repeating that story over and over, which is how it gets to us. Like, what does that mean? And how does it carry through? And that's directly to myth too, right? Because myth is definitely informing us in that way.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's my take on it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. And that's really helpful. And yeah, thanks again for being with us and sharing.
You're welcome.
And Vanessa has a really great question. If maybe you can ask it directly.
Okay, you put me on the spot. All right.
It's a great question. I want to hear you.
After all that typing, now I have to remember how I worded it. Okay, so hi, thank you.
Hi.
I appreciate your work. What I said was that I'm not a scientist. So, you know, yeah, please be gentle with me if I'm not wording it correctly or if not. But I began to think about the oral tradition, how it's very much a part of our lives as Black people, all Black people. And I was wondering how Black people sound, like for instance, our tone and how we vocalize. So I hope you understand. So not only just our tone, but how we vocalize also be captured by data. Do you understand? Like I see how you're talking about the database to get the stories and what does care and the visual. And I was just wondering, can the audio be captured?
It can.
So, okay.
It can. It's still hard. So one of the things I really love about the project is I have hours and hours of audio that eventually I want to try to make a voice. So right now, Not the Only One uses a kind of altered Google voice that's available readily. But it's getting easier and easier to create or recreate voices and tones and ways of talking using algorithmic systems. So if we take the recordings that we made when we did our oral histories and then run them through, let's see if I can remember what the algorithm, I'm never going to remember what the, like Takatron, right? There's a specific thing to generate voices. Then we could get the voice. The problem that happened with that audio was our audio is too dirty. When you're trying to recreate a voice, the audio has to be really, really clean so that it doesn't have a lot of distortion in it. But the idea of preserving tone and pattern and the way people talk, I'm super interested in. It takes a lot of processing power and a lot of time to make a good voice. Although, if you wanted to right now on Amazon, you could go to Amazon Cloud Services and they will help you make a voice that sounds kind of like yours. So that would be preserving the cadence and the way that you speak. And this is for everyone. And I'm not sure if you have all seen these, but now it's pretty easy to, if there's someone with a lot of data out in the world, right? So say Obama, someone can generate his voice using all that data that's out there, right? The audio, and then make it say whatever they want, which is an interesting problem right now. So it's kind of deep fakes, and we've been hearing about, and actually today I was just hearing with the war that has just started up, they think that Russia is using some of this technology to make statements that haven't been made, right? To put statements into the world that they used recordings to make, someone from Kiev say something that is inflammatory. And they're trying to verify the voice right now. So the technology is definitely here. It's getting better and better. You can definitely try to do it. If you want to just see how it's done in little bits, you can go to Mozilla's Deep Voice project, where Mozilla is collecting voices so that AI systems understand a broader set of voices better, right? Because I don't know if you've ever talked to something, people who are accented still have problems. It's getting better and better, but there are issues. People who have different tones and cadences have problems. So they're trying to make this common voice machine that understands many, many different voices. So they're asking people to donate sentences, like go and actually speak, or to listen and transcribe so that they can develop something. But you can do this. We can do this now, what you're asking. And I'm trying to do it. It just takes a lot of effort and work, and it's kind of hard. I actually did it. We ran it even with Nokia Bell Labs, and we got a voice, but it's not great yet, right? So it's like, okay, how do we make this really good? Did that make sense?
Sorry, I didn't know if I was supposed to come back, but I would
No,
say yes. It
Okay.
does make sense. And thank you.
You're welcome.
Great question. We have a question from Karsten Chase, and I'll read it. I love that you're trying to add care and diversity into AI, but I wanted to ask what your overall end goal is. Is it full sentience or a realistic impersonation of personality? Also, do you have a time frame on when you would like to see this goal reached?
Oh, Carson, that's a really hard one, right? I think that for a long time we're going to have realistic impressions of what things are, right? But people are working towards something that has a much more sentient way of being in the world, right? So a lot of the top AI researchers in the world think that as AI continues to compute faster than our brains do, right, then they're going to become at least able to kind of outthink us or wit us through speed alone, right? And how you kind of start to think about what that is. And I think that gets really, really interesting and really frightening at the same time, although I try not to be fear-based in terms of the way I think about the technologies. It's more like, well, if these technologies are coming down the pipe, how do we start to collaborate with them? How do we partner with them? What can we do together? And how do we teach them, or how do we teach it, or it them? How do we teach them so that they are entities that have a good core that allows them not to be, I'm going to use the evil word, not to be bad actors among us, right? And I think that one of the things that a lot of people fear is that they will emulate us and what we've done and how we've done history already. And that's actually one of my fears, which means they're going to have some bad acting in them, right? Like we have. So how do we kind of get them to have a different compass in which to encounter the world? And that's hard. But I don't think we're going towards full sentience yet, but I actually do think eventually, but maybe not in my lifetime, we will get there. but I'm going to say one last thing about that. The simulation will be interesting, and I'm thinking about, even with an Alexa, like I gave my aunt who's in her 80s an Alexa, and she talks to it like she'll say thank you to it, and she'll address it as a kind of friend. And so it's this like odd training of ourselves while we're training these machines, even when they're not that thing yet. So I think there's this weird symbiosis of how we're kind of training each other, and they'll mirror us a bit, but I don't know that they'll actually be sent. Although they will ask for rights and things like that before that.
I love that you used here we go. I love that you use that example of with your like giving them the Alexa and they're treating it as a person, because when iPhones were starting to come out and I got like an iPhone 4 or something and it had Siri in it, I was with my grandpa and he didn't really understand the technology of that, and I was like asking it questions, obviously, because it's a cool feature and I just like testing it out. And he was like, you got to stop bothering it. You can't keep talking to the lady because she'll think, you'll get on her nerves. She's trying to do her job. And I'm like, there's not an actual lady in there, but it's just funny that you brought that up. But thank you for answering the question. I love that. I'm so glad that you're here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's going to get interesting. Our concepts of self, to go back to the thesis of the exhibition, are going to shift so much, so we'll see. Anything else? I see hands up there. Robert,
and there's a question from Alex. Building off the notion that we're all programmed to some extent by external preconceptions and beliefs and methods, how do you strive to break away from that in your artistic approach?
I tend to so I tend to go rogue, and I don't know what this is. Like I tend to do my own thing, and not follow the rules very well, and that's a basic way that I start doing that, which gets me in trouble when I'm trying to work with people who are doing things in the rules-based way and trying to get something out of them. I don't know, I think that for me, critical thinking is a thing, and being able to think independently and deeply, which I don't know that we train so well in the United States, is really important. So I would hope that for anybody, external preconceptions, I'm going to also say I'm in general just a believer in travel as well, in terms of breaking one's preconceptions and notions about what's going on in the world. I often tell people, well, drive across this country if you do nothing else, because the experience of what you think it is and what we've been told and how people are, I think they're two different things. So I'm always experimenting and being curious and trying to push the envelope and trying to do the things that people tell me I can't do, even though, and having conversations with folks. That's really basically it on that approach. And then try to help people do that as well.
Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Stephanie, it's great to see you. We saw each other last summer. It's wonderful to hear your work. Yeah. At the Carson Center, we're like educating students both in kind of with some technical depth and some like code experience and things, but we're also kind of introducing them to approaches as an artist. And so I'm just curious, like I'm curious if you could describe sort of what you see as things that are particular that an artist can do in engaging with technologies when they're not coding them sometimes, like kind of like it's like what can an artist learn through kind of like interacting with GPT-3 or some similar technology? I guess like something about the complementary approaches, I know, between sort of how an engineer might code a system working with like GPT-3 or something versus, how an artist might interrogate it, like taking it as a ready-made or something and kind of learning what values are embedded within it and those sorts of things. So thank you. Sorry that rambled a bit.
No, it's a really good question. It's what I think about a lot because, as I said, I'm a tinkerer, right? Like I'm not someone who's a hard coder. I've learned more, but I don't code well. However, getting my hands dirty, just going in and starting to like, okay, I'm gonna run this, I'm gonna run this, I'm gonna run this. Okay, fine. I see what it does. Now I'm gonna start to change some values just to see what that does. I feel like it teaches you so much about the way that things actually run, right? And the way that outcomes change and what changes them, right? Like the simple difference of feeding one data set or another. Like if I fed some algorithms like Toni Morrison books, right? And if I say feed the same algorithm, I don't know, Robert Frost or something, you know, you can see, you can start to hear and feel how that is working. And I think that's super valuable. And actually, I started talking to all my art, like I work in a department with art historians and folks. And it's like, listen, if you're going to do this, if you're going to criticize it, I think you need to get your hands dirty, right? Just go in and play. Don't be afraid. Go to Google Colab. That's pretty easy to run some stuff. And after you run it, it's kind of fun. And in fact, I've had classes, I taught an art and AI class a semester ago, and it's really interesting because the kids I got for this class, like barely a tech, like mostly painters, right? Like no tech. But once we got beyond the, oh my gosh, I can't do this barrier, and started playing with it, like they did amazing things because they had something really great to collaborate. And then they started picking at it and picking at it. And we'd get things that were just so unexpected. And I think that picking, it's like driving cross country, actually, right? You just learn something in a much different way. You internalize it, you question it, and you can discuss it in different ways. And when you talk about engineers, like I've been in spaces where, you know, I've asked engineers about qualitative things or to think creatively, and I've watched their heads literally explode from the questions. I was like, they like explode, like they just didn't know how to handle like the more human questions, right? And so it's like, wow, you're kind of creating the systems that are holding us. What is that? And we definitely need these kind of hybrid collaborations, or at least people who are playing in different spaces. So I think artists should have a lot of fun and go in there and just play. You know.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really appreciate it. Yeah.
You're welcome. Yeah.
And Sam has
I'm sorry?
Sam has a question.
Cool.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed your presentation, and I got to see your exhibition with Bina 48 at the Bemis. And I was wondering, I feel a large part of these interactions with AI and data, are especially AI, are somewhat domineered by the uncanny valley, the feeling of the uncanny valley, with the the unnatural speech patterns and off-putting appearances. But as AI advances and inevitably becomes like indistinguishable from humans, how do you see, like maybe not sentient, but how do you see our exploration into data and our interactions with AI changing?
First of all, I think it depends on who's making those systems. Like a question that I ask routinely now when I'm on the phone and I get a call, it's like, are you human? Right? Because I'm not sure anymore, like who's human and who isn't, and how I'm supposed to deal with this thing. And then the frustration level just grows, because then you're like, oh, okay, you're totally not human and you're not giving me the thing that I want. So the question for me becomes, how do we balance those relationships? Because they do play out like relationships. Do we honor them? Do we just cast them aside, right? And so thinking about things like, you know, right now in a lot of, well, in care centers, especially for older folks, they have this seal called Paro. And Paro was like a companion. And like, Sherry Levine was talking about it being really horrible, because we warehouse people and then we give them this thing and say, just play with this like weird animatronic thing. But at the same time, if you think about it, if that weird animatronic thing makes that person happier in the moment, is it something we should do or not? Like the person is there regardless. I'm hopefully their family visits them as well. But if there's that moment where that's an element of care, does it matter that it's not a living element of care, or does it matter that it's care? Right. And I think there are all these spaces where we're going to have to negotiate what we find our level of comfort and acceptability of the technologies are, like what we want to deal with. I find that like I just don't want to deal with the robots online in voice form. Right? I see that it's driving me nuts. But the question becomes, where is that line? What's acceptable and why? Right? If it's just to babysit everything, is it like abdicate responsibility and just have a babysitter? That's not good. But to help and cheer, that is like, so it's a weird space. And we're just gonna have to negotiate it. And it's such a hard question, right? Because like I also find myself often upset with Siri because it's dumb. Like it just knows nothing, right? Like you ask it. But then and clearly I live with these things. Like I live with them half for research, half because they're fun to have around. And my Google Home is starting to regress in terms of its capabilities. I'm like, what is this? And why am I so angry that it's no longer just doing what I asked it to do? Right. And so clearly I'm also expecting it to serve, which is another thing that I'm thinking a lot about, because with Not the Only One, that project, because it is so wonky, because it doesn't meet people's expectations. People often get mad. Curators want to throw it out the window because it doesn't always reply in the way they think. So I've been thinking about, well, I just told the curator, well, it's not a service thing. It's an entity coming into its own. So you can't expect it just to reply because you asked it a question. Right? And so like where we place them and how we place them and why we're placing the entities, how we're dealing with them becomes really key to me.
That
and how we treat
expectation.
it.
Yeah, that
Sorry, go ahead.
expectation. I was just gonna say that expectation to serve is like super interesting insight. Like that's, yeah. Thank you. That was a great answer. Super insightful.
Oh, thank you.
And we'll have one last question by Christopher Williams.
But your cats certainly seem to have a lot to say. But I was interested in like the language that the AI was actually using, and how you were talking about in your presentation, how the AI was like responding in these like strange and like wonky ways, as you put it. But also the language that the AI was using, and in particular, like the one that was developed from your family. The AI that was using it like reminded me of like some of N.K. Jemison's writing about like other consciousness and like how it's kind of imperceptible to like human language. And I was wondering like, first, like I was kind of wondering like, do you think that the AI is responding in a way that it understands, not in a way that, and then you said like it responds again, it has like another, or it responds to the same question, but it responds in a way that's more understanding to our way of understanding. And then I was also wondering like, if you change the language and the information of the language, like more indigenous language or African language, do you think that would change how the AI would respond?
So yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think it knows what it's saying, but I do think it has a concept of how things are put together. And so it's constantly trying to kind of recreate some patternings that it says. Like I learned from the Not the Only One that my family says, especially the women, we say sorry way too much. It says sorry an awful lot. And it's like this pattern of how we say sorry. And then when I listen to the tapes, it's like, oh, right, we say sorry all the time. I know there's a pattern, like I was saying, my aunt doesn't finish her sentences. And it has a tendency to kind of have these run-on sentences that don't finish. Like they're not. And that's about picking up the patterns of the way that we speak. And then it tries to put things together in that way too. Like one of the favorite things that I've ever heard it to say is take it to the would-be. And take it to the would-be, I don't know exactly what that means. I know it kind of put it together, and it sort of reminds me of my grandmother all at the same time, right? So it's like these combinations of things that it's managed to come up with in some way from the patterning. I think in different languages, it would kind of hold on to those languages and the nuances of the languages, right? And that's the magic of training things with different languages and different ways of interpreting the world, or different knowledge systems, right? Because it picks up the way that that knowledge system works and tries to replicate it in some way, shape, or form. And so it carries some of that, but it's not like I don't think it's like it's making it, or at least with the sophistication that I'm using, it doesn't make it itself. Although there have been systems where, not maybe 2 years ago, they had two assistants talking to each other. And eventually they started to use their own language. And that was a point at which the researchers shut it down immediately, right? Because all of a sudden they're speaking in something we have no access to, but they're having a dialogue that seems intelligible to them. What does that mean? Right? So
yeah.
There are many answers to that question, but I do think that I don't really think that they're developing, but in more sophisticated forms, perhaps.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, unless there's another question. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for an amazing conversation. And I hope that you'll all join us next week and for the next events around this exhibition. The recording of today's talk will be available shortly, so you'll be able to see it again. And so again, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.